skills, and I'm chairing things today, so anything timely now is all my fault. I'm delighted to see so many of you here and to take part in another one of our masterclasses. So we've set up this series of masterclasses that run monthly. And it's really kind of opportunity to use one of those old-fashioned techniques in this information age of just getting together really and discussing some key developments within the skills system. And importantly, we've been developing these seminars. Come in. We've been developing these seminars with experts in the field and coordinating that really through our partners at the Lakes Research Centre, which always have to look it up. We're represented here by Alison Fuller in terms of Lakes. It stands for Life Chances in Knowledge, Economies and Societies. And essentially we wanted to work with Lakes on this in terms of really because they're working at the Institute of Education and a Centre of Excellence in Education and Skills. And that was an opportunity to really make sure that we were staying ahead of some of these latest developments. We're delighted today to have David Finegold here to join us, who is a real authority, international authority on how skills employment systems work. For many years, I hope you don't mind me saying that, David, for many years produced lots of publications in this area in terms of really helping us collectively, globally, get a handle on developments in labour markets, in employment relationships, in organisations, and thinking through some of the implications for skills and people and how we can maximise the talents of people to really drive economic growth. Today, Dave is going to be talking about some of the challenges facing higher education. So at that point, I'll say some summary things at the end in terms of future masterclasses and so on, but I think at that point, that's all I was going to say by way of introduction and hand things over to Dave.
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be back in England, see lots of familiar faces and some new ones. I think this title slide sort of reflects a little bit the changes that are going on in higher ed. So you see, up until last year, I was a senior vice president, had been a dean at Rutgers, but I'm on leave now, and I'm with a startup in the US, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at one slide in the presentation, called American Honors. And so part of the move there was feeling like it would be fun to go from being a disruptee to a disruptor in higher ed. So I joined a startup and share with you about that. What I wanted to do was kind of share perspectives both from the research and the work I've done there and a little bit from this new platform, and then hopefully have lots of time at the end for questions. And so as you'll see from your packets there, you've got the slides, and I'll go through them fairly quickly because I'd like to maximize the time for discussion since we've got lots of experts here, particularly many more people who are far more current on the current UK issues than I am. And so I don't want to purport to be an expert since it's been a long time since I was doing my work here. So when we look at higher ed globally, colleague Richard Freeman has called this period of the great doubling, the fact that we've seen an unprecedented increase around the world in the volume of graduates. This is particularly, as we'll see, happened in emerging economies, although we're seeing it really throughout the OECD. And what's been interesting is that despite that huge increase in supply, the returns to higher ed have maintained in almost every place very strong. But we're seeing many new competitors entering and also big technological changes. And so influencing both the demand side for jobs, but also how we deliver and think about higher ed. And particularly, we'll talk a bit about online education and MOOCs and some of the implications there. The growth, as I say, and this I think is useful to see for two things. One, both how much increase there has been in countries like India and China in a relatively short period of time, but also it gives you a sense, if you're a corporation, right, you're thinking about where can I find talented graduates? And what this shows is that the vast majority of them are concentrated in the US, India, and China, and that has really shifted dramatically over a fairly short period, really in just one generation. We're seeing growth across the board, but if you're thinking about volumes of graduates, that's really where you can find them. So I want to talk to you about work that has come out of the last few years where myself and colleagues have been looking at these two largest population centers in the world, India and China, which together account for about 35% of the global workforce. And what's interesting there, if you go back to the work I did way, way long ago here on the low-skill equilibrium, is you could have said that for both of these countries, until very recently, they were in that kind of economy. They had very few people in high-skill jobs, very few people highly qualified, but there was a relative balance. There wasn't a lot of demand for graduates, and there was not a great deal of supply. That's changed significantly. You've seen from that data huge increases in the volume of graduates, but you have not yet seen the increase in the demand for them, and so it's a quite unstable situation. And that is globally something we know can be very destabilizing. So if you look at what led in part to the unrest in Egypt and Syria and other places, where you have situations where you have highly educated people and there aren't opportunities for them, that can be a real recipe for destabilization. So if you look at the case of China, what you see there is that they have moved quite rapidly from a focus on being the world's leader in low-cost manufacturing to much more of an emphasis in improving the skill supply. And what's dramatic there is how quickly they've been able to do it. And they have been able to focus there on really increasing the quantity of graduates. So if you look here, they went from just about 3% of the population getting a degree to now the latest date is up to a third of the population getting a degree, or from 700,000 to 7 million graduates in the span of 20 years. And so a level of increase in research universities and higher ed capacity that we've really never seen anywhere before in human history. What they've realized, though, in doing that is it's one thing to increase supply, but now the focus is on not just getting graduates, but really focusing on quality. So much more of an emphasis on putting together world-class graduates, on putting together innovators, on trying to win some Nobel Prizes, on increasing the number of patents, and also thinking about reform of higher ed so that they can benchmark and attain the best levels that you would find in the UK or Australia or the US. And so one of the ways they've been going about that is actually inviting those universities in to set up joint campuses. The UK has been a real leader in this. Places like Liverpool and Nottingham were one of the first to go in and set up joint venture campuses there, to both for them to recruit a lot of very able graduates, but also for the Chinese to really learn from and educate people in English and in a different way of providing higher ed. I was actually involved myself at Rutgers in a project where we were going to do this. There was an administrative change. We decided not to go through with it, but it was fascinating to go through that whole process of thinking about what would it be like to build a brand new campus from scratch for 10,000 students, and how could you do that? And so, and what would we take from the Ministry of Ed? And in questions, I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like. Despite all of those improvements, though, if you look in detail, as I have with my colleague Mingwei Liu at Rutgers, there are huge issues in the Chinese skills system, and they go from a big mismatch between supply and demand. It's still a largely state-controlled system, not very responsive to market signals. Much of the education and training provision is not very innovative. There's still a lot of people getting up and reading from textbooks and rote learning, focus on memorization, not as much on innovation there. The enterprises, because the business model has been working relatively well for them in the lower skill ends, have not had huge incentives to focus on more high skill production strategies and using these strategies. But that's starting to change because wages are really going up, particularly in the major cities in China, at a very rapid rate. And so they're no longer in a position with Vietnam or Indonesia or Bangladesh to compete on the lowest labor cost. And so there's much more of an emphasis, and the government is encouraging this to focus on, okay, can you move into those higher value-added sectors like biotech and IT and others. And there's a huge internal issue with China in that there's been a migration of about 500 million people from the villages to the cities. So it's fascinating. If you spend any time there, you go to a third-tier city in China, and it only has 8 million people. And you just think, you know, where else does anyone talk about third tier that way? But there's been a huge urbanization, but much of that population doesn't have fully equal rights when they move there. And so their children, in terms of access to the best schools, are really limited. And that creates real issues of inequality there and concerns going forward. So there are a lot of unanswered questions in China. One is how quickly they will make this transition from a reliance on being the world leader in the low-cost manufacturing again to these higher skill niches. How are foreign firms going to respond to the rising wages? Are they going to pull out, or are they going to move up with China in terms of their investment? Can you be an innovation leader without being fully bought into free information, free political society? I'm just reading a book now about Google and its decision to go there and then to pull out, and all of the issues faced by that. And that's true across sort of the knowledge-based innovation economy. How do you balance those tensions? There's a real risk that there's been a huge overinvestment in infrastructure and real estate. And so some of what you saw with Japan 20 years ago, where that market collapsed and that's had very long-term effects, could happen in China. I think the government is very conscious of that and is trying to mitigate it, but it will be interesting to see how it plays out. There's interesting things going on there now, both in terms of trade union reform and intellectual property reform. Neither fully formed, but lots of debates and experimentation discussion we could talk about if you're interested. And then I think, interestingly, both economically and socially, perhaps the biggest questions are around the long-term effects of the one-child generation, or what the Chinese call the little emperors or empresses, or the golden bowl generation. This is, imagine 4 grandparents, 2 parents, all focused on one kid and their success, and that's having huge effects in terms of the expectations of those children, both for education, but incomes and other things. And what you see is this is a really dramatic effect that's just starting to come through now. So this is hitting the upper secondary and the higher ed system in a big way. And so it's hard to imagine in a country that has 1.3 billion people that you would be talking about shortage of labor, but people are worried about this. That particularly what you're seeing is a very rapidly aging society. And so China is the first society really in the modern industrial age where you're seeing it get old before it gets wealthy. And so now Chinese demographics already look like a UK or a European country, but it didn't put in a full welfare state. And so you're seeing this generation that's coming through with this incredibly heavy savings rate, because that's both going to education, but also thinking about who's going to look after them in retirement, because they don't have the government safety net in the same way. And so very interesting things playing out there. India is the complete reverse. So India has what they call the demographic dividend, 550 million people under the age of 25. And so a huge opportunity in terms of young talent, but also a huge challenge, because or a large majority of them would like to see educational opportunity, and the question is, can the government meet it in time? When you compare these two countries, what you see is a lot of times they're yin and yang. So China's strength in low-end manufacturing, India's strength in higher-end services. China, very strong state, emphasis on everything. India, a large state, but not so efficient in terms of getting things done. You see issues of corruption in both places. China, you see the questions about, can you innovate without democracy? India, the question is, with the world's largest democracy, we've just seen this huge election take place, but it operates in a very kind of messy way. So it's hard for them to mobilize and get major things done, and that has both upsides and downsides. And so we're already seeing some significant supply side constraints there. And the government solution in India to this, in terms of education reform, has been an extreme form of affirmative action. So they have basically said, well, in order to ensure equality, we're going to set aside half of all the places in the higher ed system for lower social class or lower socioeconomic groups. And that has created real tensions, because that's such a high, and that ticket is the real difference in terms of your life success. And so people in the middle class can be very concerned about that approach. So in India, we have a bit of a paradox. As I'll show you a bit in terms of the data, in almost every level, they've really struggled to match what China or other emerging economies have done in education, and yet they are seen by corporations around the world and many other emerging economies as a real success model in terms of a skill-based approach to development, because they've been so successful, particularly in IT, software, and outsourcing. And so the question is, how have they done it? And my thesis is that this is really the result of a thing I call the 3 E's. So it's the combination of an exam system, which, while certainly imperfect in terms of assessment, does a relatively egalitarian job of sorting people who are smart and willing to work really hard and studying to pass this exam. having elite institutions like the IITs and the IIMs that produce really good quality graduates, and the advantage of speaking English. Now, they don't all speak English, and it's just one of more than 20 languages that you have over 1 million people speaking in India. But the fact that most of the educated elite are fluent in English as well as 1 or 2 other languages makes them much more employable in the global economy than many Chinese graduates. So if you look at India, what you see is that they're dramatically underperforming in terms of even upper secondary education compared to not the European economies, not to the US, but to other emerging economies. Where you've seen a huge growth is in the provision of engineering and business degrees. Those are the 2 high demand areas in the higher ed sector. So you've seen an explosion in particularly private institutions, nominally nonprofit, but actually operating and making a lot of money to meet this demand with very varying quality. And so what you see is the latest research that McKinsey did for NASSCOM suggests that while you're getting a huge number of graduates coming out, that from the perspective of most employers, that they don't view them as having the skills they need to really succeed. But you're getting the qualification, which is what the folks want. You see there's also real challenges. If we have time, we can talk about it in their vocational education system, in the standards of their primary education system, and relatively low levels of investment in formal workforce development outside a few of the leading IT and business process outsourcing firms. So when I started this work on India in the comparison with China, I thought that it was a fairly pessimistic situation in the sense that I didn't think there was enough resources at the national level, given the scale of the need, to fix the system in time. But what I've come to believe is that actually the resources are there, particularly if you look at private investment as well as government investment, but that the problem has been that the system has been using the resources really inefficiently and poorly. And this is, you particularly see this in the K through 12 system, where even the very poor people are opting out and investing almost all of their daily wages in private schools because the public schools are doing so poorly. And so taking the money that's there and simply allowing it to be used more effectively, I think, could meet a lot of the demand, but it's not clear what will happen. And there, really, it's going to come down to the decisions that the new government takes and how much they're able to mobilize and really push forward reforms. So now I want to turn to the 3rd largest system out there, namely the US. When I started my work on the low-skill equilibrium back in the mid-'80s, the US was the clear global leader thanks to the GI Bill. It was the first really mass higher ed system. What you see, though, is that the US is the only one of the major economies which has actually gone down. So for the first time in US history, young people are less likely to end up with a degree than the previous generation, whereas everybody else has seen a steep and continuing increase. And so the US went from being first in providing access to higher ed for its population. Now it ranks about 16th in the OECD and falling. And at the same time as you have a volume increase, you also have a huge inequality problem. So one of the hopes of the American dream was that higher ed would be a great leveler, that it would provide an opportunity for people, talented people of whatever background, to succeed and rise in a meritocracy. What we see, in fact, if you look at Carolyn Hoxby and others' research, is just the reverse. We have something in the US we call the undermatching problem. So if you're born in the lower quartile of income, only 8% of young people do what we would advise as a rational strategy for applying to college, to look at the best schools you could go to, apply for some good target schools, and then have a safety. Nearly 2/3 of those in the upper income quartile do that who are qualified. And so what you see is it's actually perpetuating the gap between lower and socioeconomic groups in our higher ed system. It's not reducing. And a big reason for this has been the huge gap that we're seeing in costs. And so what we've got is a squeeze on the middle class that's occurring because the cost of college has gone up over 400% in the last 30 years, while actually the median family income is barely keeping up with general inflation. And so we're seeing, for most Americans, not the top 1% or 5%, but for most Americans, their wages have been flat in real terms, but the costs of higher ed and healthcare have been going up dramatically. And so people are being squeezed out of the ability to participate in it. And so what we're seeing as a result of those pressures is real disruption in what is happening with higher education. And so we have lots of different models out there. And what I would argue, particularly in the US context, if you look not just at people coming straight from high school, but you look at all of higher ed participation, which includes almost half of the system for those who are adults or adult learners taking part, that they're making a decision based on 3 key dimensions. So they're thinking about, first of all, what we would typically associate with higher ed, which is the brand or the quality. What's the best place I can go in terms of the education that will be delivered in quality? A second thing that's happened, particularly over the last 20 to 30 years, is convenience. So the explosion in adult education has really been driven by making it easier for part-time learners to go while working at night, on the weekends, or increasingly online. And then the third big factor, given what I just showed you, was cost. Namely, can you afford to go, right? And be able to finance your education. And so as we think about the balance of those 3 factors, what I'm going to argue is that how people approach those is really going to affect their educational choices. And the reason I think that there's been so much press and excitement about this notion of MOOCs, massive open online courses, is that for the first time they seem to offer the nirvana of all 3, right? Which is you get the best professors from all over the world offering courses which you could take from anywhere, and most of them are free. So that's a pretty good combination if you can figure out how to put that together, right? You know, lots of flexibility, great quality, at least in terms of the brand, and a very good price point. So I mentioned that I had made this leap from public higher ed to a startup, our organization called American Honors, and what we're trying to do is address those twin issues of the US losing its lead in higher ed in terms of access and participation, but also making higher ed more affordable. And the model that we're using to do it is by building honors colleges in partnership with US community colleges. So students do the first 2 of their 4 years of a degree at the community college in this special program, and then having partners and advisors who help the students to get into the very best colleges and universities in the US. And so we've only been going a couple of years, but these are some of the places where our students were able to get accepted in this last year. And so what it's showing is that you can create these other pathways if you put all of the elements of a model there together to support it. It's challenging, and we can talk more about that if you want, but the big difference, if you think about this here in the UK, is that the community colleges in the US have really been set up not just with pathways with certain specific local universities, but with the associate's degree that offers a potential, though it's typically been unrealized, to allow you to transfer those credits to universities all across the US. And so what we're trying to do is make that work a lot more efficiently and smoothly and create the first national network of 2- and 4-year institutions. Another attempt to address these issues has come out of Western Governors University. So they're using a different approach. This was a bunch of Western states getting together with their governors and saying, how can we leverage, pool our online resources, and particularly help adult learners? And the focus there was on using, first of all, a competency-based approach to higher ed. Secondly, bringing in accreditation of prior learning so that you could start with people where and when, what they brought to it, and then using the benefits of online and access and self-pace to allow people at a very low cost to get through quickly. And so it's expanded quite rapidly, now serving over 40,000 students per year across 19 states. So to talk about probably the biggest new development in higher ed in the last few years is this notion of MOOCs. They went from most people not knowing what it meant to having now millions of students registered. There are a number of issues that we can talk about with them. They have a very high attrition rate, at least measured in terms of people who signed up at all, and then how many finished. The pedagogy has its limits when you're trying to teach 150,000 people at once. There's only so much interaction you can have. And up till now, for most of them, there's no clear business model. So as someone, when I was at Rutgers who was looking at this, the question was, okay, this is great, we can access all these, but how do we pay for this over time? And that part has been much less developed. One of the experiments with trying to make that work is a really interesting one that's going on now at one of the top 10 computer science programs in the US at Georgia Tech. They have said that they want to offer an $8,000 master's degree in computer science, roughly, under 20% of the cost of their normal face-to-face master's degree. So if they can do that, if you can get that qualification, potentially very disruptive development. Will be interesting to see how it plays out. Also being used in other ways, so for recruiting. So one thought with the model here is students who can pass these courses around the world. This can be a great way for them to both get interested in your institution, see some of your best professors, but also demonstrate whether they can do it. Another way in which it's being used is for flipping the classroom. So we're seeing a lot of it on the college campus itself being used in this new way to try to encourage people to change their pedagogy, move away from traditional lecture to use this and restructure the way the classroom is used. MIT and Harvard in their version of this in edX are using this for enhancing alumni relations. So they're now offering their alums as a way to stay connected, a chance to take these courses with professors and build. They're obviously connected to the fundraising aspect there. Nobody is sure where this is heading. If they tell you they know, don't believe them. One fascinating example of that is Harvard Business School, right, which has many of the leading strategic thinkers, has been having an internal debate between two of their gurus. So on the one hand, you have Clayton Christensen, who's the author of The Innovator's Dilemma and has been actively involved in disrupting higher ed. And on the other side, you have Michael Porter, who sort of wrote literally the textbook on corporate strategy, and they're arguing diametrically opposed views about what Harvard should do, Harvard Business School should do when it comes to online education. And so, even at that august level, you see these real tensions in how this plays out. With all of this disruption, I would argue that I would still expect not to see more incremental change rather than radical change for most higher ed institutions. Universities are, after all, among the most long-lived institutions on the planet, much more so than corporations. Really only organized religion rivals them for longevity. And I would argue that they produce many benefits beyond their graduates, right, in terms of local communities, in terms of economic development and other things. And the interesting paradox here is, even with all of these pressures, funding pressures, other things they're under, demand for their product has been at an all-time high. And so, particularly for the more selective institutions, part of what's fueled that, and I'll show you some data in a second, is the surge in international students who are looking to study abroad. And I think that the UK has some really interesting insights to draw on because it's been a real pioneer with the Open University in distance education. And so what I would argue is that a lot of what MOOCs are likely to do may be similar to what the OU experience was, which was not to displace the brick and mortar universities, but rather to serve new clienteles that they were not serving well, particularly adult learners. So one of the things not known is that most of the people completing MOOCs already have a degree. So they're coming back to it. They have the skills needed to do that well. I think it's a huge boon for people around the world who don't have access to good local higher ed options. So the chance to be able to do this, to have access to that is a great thing. And I think we're going to see it really affecting pedagogy across the board, not just in the purely online environment. The other thing that I think we've been clinging to up till now is one of the big reasons for the longevity, the continued health of universities has been that people need that qualification in order to be able to go on into employment. But I want to share with you an interesting example where that isn't the case. So this is the India School of Business, created only in the last just 15 years that it's been set up. But the fascinating thing about this is it's gone from an idea to being now the top-rated business school in India on some measures, and it's done that without offering a degree. It chose not to offer a degree because the process you have to go through in India to get certified for a degree was not one that it wanted to do. It didn't respect what was there at some of the requirements they would impose. So the way they did it was by focusing on the two things that the graduates or the prospective students really wanted. One was they have the best boards you could imagine in terms of employers. So they have all of the leading Indian employers and all of the leading multinationals hiring people in India, shaping the development of this. So they're basically saying, this is a good place to go. We want to hire the graduates at the end. And then secondly, in terms of professors, they set up a very flexible delivery model so that Indian professors from all over the world who wanted to go back to India for 4 weeks or 5 weeks could come and teach short courses in a one-year concentrated MBA. And so they leveraged the brand names of Wharton, of London Business School, of Northwestern, of some of the very best business schools around the world that weren't formal institutional partners of ISB. Some were not, but their professors were among those doing the education. So there's been a huge increase in the international movement of students, from about 1 million students now to over 4 million. And the United States has been the big loser in terms of market share, but still seen an absolute increase here. The UK, on the other hand, has been a real leader. So if you look at the changes over the last decade, the UK has seen the greatest increase in terms of that, grabbing that share of those 4 million students and attracting them here. Also, you've seen Australia, other countries benefiting significantly. And so just to conclude, what I would argue is that as you all think about what does this mean for traditional universities in the UK, dealing with all of these issues, that the universities need to think about both, if they're brick and mortar institutions, what can they do to maximize the values of the physical campus experience? And so it's a very expensive piece of real estate and capital investment to have a whole campus. And so what are all the ways in which that can be leveraged more effectively to create an environment that it's very hard to replicate online, not just in terms of undergrad or graduate education, but in terms of how you think about the whole nexus of local community economic development, where it really is seen as a central institution there. And yet at the same time, as US universities certainly, but I think UK others are facing more and more pressures to deliver more, but with not as much necessarily government funding, can they develop new lines of revenue and other things that will support it? And so, concluding more with questions than answers, I think it's not clear who's going to be the big winners in global and regional higher ed. I think the UK is very well positioned. We're going to see a lot of top universities from around the world doing it. But one of the things about this model is, you know, people are starting to ask the question, well, if I can get access to a few great intro economics courses or intro sociology courses, do we really need thousands of different versions of that? And that's going to be an interesting thing playing out. What happens if learning outcomes are decoupled from certification? So if you get past the point where you really don't need a degree in order to get a job, if you can show what you can do, then that has real significant implications. What are the impacts going to be of the MOOCs on the existing models? And there's been a huge move in the UK and the US and others to using online in a different model, right? Which is charging similar amounts to what you charge for your traditional delivery, but leveraging the value of convenience. Well, will people continue to pay that if there are free options? How will that play out? And then one of the real infancies here, but I think something that will have a big effect, and right now the place where I see it most strongly is in something called the Khan Academy at the K through 12 level, which if you haven't used, I encourage you to explore, but it's the notion of adaptive learning. So being able to use these systems to really identify just what people know and don't know, and then tailor the next education that they get based around that. And we're seeing that in certain areas playing out, and I think as artificial intelligence and other systems evolve, we're going to see far more of that occurring, which will have big impacts in terms of the way we think about delivering education from one to many to a much more customized approach. To conclude here, from the UK's perspective, I think the system is actually starting from a very good place. And so what's interesting to me, looking at it coming from across the pond, is it's fascinating. Right now we're having a big debate in the US about what would look to most people who've lived through the last 20 years of higher ed in the UK as a really fluffy approach from the Obama administration to introduce the first inklings of actually looking at performance measures on US universities. Whereas in the UK, first there was a tremendous use of metrics to drive growth in the higher ed system, from a very low performer to now being one that's above the OECD average. And then through the research assessment exercise, the UK has actually, really tried to channel funding toward departments, not just whole institutions, where they're seeing strong research. In the US, we're at the earliest phases of proposing things which is nowhere near as high stakes as this, and yet there's huge resistance from the system. And so the ability here, when the government has ideas thinking about reforms of the system, I think it's striking how much quicker things can move in the UK than we see in the US economy. So what I would say is, in terms of thinking about the options here, I'd love to start the discussion is, the UK starts from having one of the world's leading higher ed systems in terms of both the respect, the ranking of the institutions, but also the fact that they've been able to grow significantly, more than triple the participation, with very low attrition rates, particularly compared to most other European systems and the US. International students have been a huge growth area and a vitally needed support funding. And so I think, to me, when I look at it, the issues I think about are, so what are the best pathways for the other 60% of the population who are not going and getting degrees? What are the ways to enhance further ties between universities and employers? So address the issue that we're seeing now of more and more graduates coming out and not necessarily finding good jobs, good fits with their skills, so that particularly for that middle third, that there's a really good fit there. And then what can be done to keep the UK, as there's going to be more and more intensified competition, in this place of being a real leading destination that people from around the world seek to go for higher ed. And I think of that not just from the perspective of a badly needed revenue stream or diversity in the classroom, but also because, at least knowing the data from the US, that source of the brightest people from around the world coming to your country can be a huge driver of future innovation and economic success. So apologies for rushing through that real quick, but I knew we were limited on time and wanted to try to make sure we left plenty of time for questions.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you very much, David. Wow, very high energy, high impact presentation. So hopefully stimulated a lot of questions. What I'm going to do in the remaining minutes, I think I'll take questions in groups and do it in that way. So who wants to kick off? Okay, let's look over this side first. So then, would you like to say your name and where you're from?
David Morris from the University of Sheffield. I think one of the interesting things about China kind of expanding is that they've been kind of outsourcing students to the rest of the world. So obviously here we've been receiving a lot of them, especially on graduate courses. Economics at our university is 90+% Chinese students studying here. So with them developing their own universities to a higher level, bringing kind of UK and US universities to China to kind of provide these courses, the knock-on effects in UK in the long run, I think, would be quite, or could potentially be quite large, in terms of us not necessarily having the numbers to provide graduate courses, but also these 90% of students that are coming over to do it as like international students are paying the most money as well. So how do you kind of see that? If we lose all this funding, all these students, all this diversity, is the undergraduate program might be okay, but is a graduate program going to
Shall we take it on? So thank you for that, David. Jay, did you want to?
Yeah, Jay, I'm for education. My question's about China too.
Sure.
Fascinating. I just hadn't appreciated the scale of the growth in the last 20 years. I was just wondering if you were able to give a breakdown of what that growth looks like in terms of programs, and what proportion of that huge increase is traditional 3-year longer degrees, how much of it are technical degrees, perhaps on a 2-year kind of HND, HNC scale, and how much of it's online, just to get a flavour for how they're delivering that kind of growth.
Have we got any other questions about China in kind of related area, or should we? Okay, let's come back to that.
Sure. So I think you're absolutely right. Lots of implications for this growth of the institutions in China, because those ones I'm describing, they're delivering degrees in English. I think there may be 3 different effects. So one of the interesting things, so from the first classes when Liverpool Jiaotong set up their university, one of the fascinating things was 97% of those graduates from the undergraduate program in China then got into graduate programs in top 200 institutions around the world. So a huge, huge percentage, and many of them went abroad. So that was actually a net double positive for them, because they were getting revenue and good students in China, and actually creating a pipeline of students who were better prepared, because many of the students who come, their English is not as strong as it could be when they're starting the grad. So that was seen as a real plus. But I think the second order effects are going to be interesting, because it's not just that there will now be much less expensive options in English with UK or Australian or US degrees on them in China. But China is actually thinking, not just, I want to keep more of that at home, but also, I want to now be a destination where students from Africa, the other parts of Asia, the US, and others will come to get their degrees. And at $10,000 per year, that's going to be very cost effective. So that campus that I was designing on Hainan Island in China, we were actually designing it as a South Asian global university, but very much from the start with the idea that just because this was right on the tip, that this could be a model that you could get to from 2 hours from Vietnam, from Thailand, from all over. And so I think you'll see both of those things occurring. I think for the next, unless there's a real collapse of the Chinese economic system, my hunch would be for the next 10 to 15 years, the UK is still going to be relatively solid in that, because what's striking when you go to those third-tier cities of 8 to 10 million is there's still this huge hunger, because there's so much pent-up demand that even if that grows substantially in China, it's just going to mean, I think, that now it's not just the upper middle class, but the middle class that can invest. But long-term, definitely a big effect. In terms of how have they done it, it's amazing when you see the growth that's happened. So if you go to Guangzhou, you have a whole bunch of different Chinese traditional universities there. They set up a university city on the outskirts of it. It's 3 concentric circles. So there's a stadium for 80,000 people and all the athletics facilities that start. Then there's the dorms, and then it's like a pie with 12 different universities. That thing from scratch went from nothing to 160,000 students. They've been building the equivalent of a new research university every month. So that expansion has happened mostly in traditional degrees. Some of it's happening in technical and foundation degrees, but those are seen as much lower status. And so if you look at the relative share, that used to be a much bigger part of the Chinese higher ed system, and it's gone down. And there's very little online. There's a great deal of suspicion of it there. It's not seen as something that can deliver the same kind of quality, and the government has been very hesitant about it. So you see it used a little bit in hybrid forms with some of these joint venture partnerships, but it's nowhere near the percentage that you see in the US or in some other countries. And so that will be another interesting way, because of course this is an incredibly technologically, most of them have at least 2 smartphones, not 1. So the young people, it's not that they're scared of technology at all, but I think the deliverers of it, both from the government and the university end, have been very wary.
I just quickly ask, how does that align to their skills needs though? Because I appreciate they've got a real need for innovation and the high R&D end that the government's pushing so hard. But equally, in terms of manufacturing economy and needing those high-end technicians that don't need 3+ academic degrees.
That's why there's
are they creating an hourglass economy like we've got here?
Yeah, and there's a real concern from the government now, and there's a focus on things like U.S. community colleges and on the TAFE system, and can they figure out ways, because they are concerned that not only the hourglass effect, but particularly that you're getting lots of graduates significantly underemployed in other things, and they don't want to be doing those jobs. And the things they've had for technical skills are really not well matched at all, and so they're trying to figure out how can they reform those systems.
Is that a feature of the online outcomes as well? Because I was just thinking, as you were saying, some of the barriers to that might be, in addition, as having good performance data about the outcomes, and how employers perceive those sort of training methods as well. Is that?
Well, I think there is some of that, and certainly with MOOCs, which are very new and no one's quite sure what to make of those in terms of the employment outcomes. But I think what we've seen with I would say the second generation of online models, which are much more focused on interactivity and on delivery, is that a lot of employers have embrace them in 2 ways. One is because it's provided a way for folks, instead of having to drive and take time out from work to study, it's made it much easier for them to balance that. And also because it's allowed for, I think, an adaptation where there's been partnering to really bring in their content into very specific and kind of tailored degrees. It doesn't always happen in that. There's a lot of, as with other elements, a lot of diversity in the way the provision is done.
Thank you. Right, let's go over this side this time. Right, I know a few people here, so we can take Moira and Alison.
Okay, just 2 points. One on the 2+2
Yeah.
model that you described, and another one on the campus experience versus the home experience. The 2+2, Scotland's got quite a strong history of the HND plus the 2+2 model. And we actually, when I work with the UK Commission now, but I used to work with the Scottish Qualifications Authority. We sold in the HND into China in around 20 universities, and they used it. So this was quite, and a lot of English universities actually took the students up because they could offer top up of 1 year to bachelor's, 2 years to master's. So this was an affordable way of international people doing their 2-year base, or actually it was really 3 because they did English as well. In China, and then coming for the top up to the UK. But that was based on a fairly strong model that existed in Scotland. But so the model existed, the credit system exists in Scotland, but when they track the articulation and how many people do it, it's coming through, but it's only in certain universities. So the recruiting universities and your universities. So what I learned last week was the Funding Council has switched to a new way of negotiating funding agreements with colleges and universities, where they're going to drive this access criteria harder, and their funding outcome agreement, that will be one of the, they're turning the screw a little on, okay, how many people are access, and of course the ones who have this 2+2 model will score well in that. So that's just one point. That's quite a familiar model, the one that you're setting up here. The other one was on you're talking about MOOCs, and I think you're absolutely right. It will perhaps fill a gap, but certainly in the global market for people in work in much the way that you did. I just wonder though how much you feel the campus experience is going to have to differentiate itself a little bit better, because hearing a lot of people now, so we've had this big expansion in the UK, people going to HE, and the quality of the experience they get, and especially now as in England, not in all the countries, but they're paying, they have been taking out loans to eventually pay the fees. They're not getting much contact time, tutor time, and that for me, if they can't differentiate themselves on that, you have to ask the question. I just wondered if you, from your own experience, if you noticed any.
Well, I have this hard from a personal experience. My son he's going to enter his senior year at Harvard, and it turns out that now more and more he's not going to class, he's taking the MOOCs, and he's being taught by undergrads, because he's a statistics major. Harvard went from having more statistics professors than students to now having it be one of the most popular majors because of big data, and they don't have enough good people to do it. And so, it's been a really interesting phenomenon. But I think what you're seeing is a lot of experimentation with how do we get the best of both things going. And so I think there will be huge pressure on that, particularly as people look at, value for money in this.
Thanks, David. I was really interested in the question that you raised about what happens if learning outcomes are decoupled from certification. And I was thinking, perhaps part of the way of thinking about it for us is the types of labour market. So if here, in say healthcare, where it's a registered, regulated field, and you can protect its time and so on, then it would be hard to think about how you do that. But in terms of growth sector, I know health's a growth sector, but other growth sectors like IT and creative and cultural, which we're obviously very interested in and good at, those sectors are becoming much more freelance-based in terms of the employment relations. So there we've developed this whole entry tournament phenomenon, which we have in America as well, internships and so on. And there you have the kind of equity point, but who can afford to develop proven competence through unpaid internships and so on. But also an education curriculum point about how do we help individuals develop the kind of marketing skills and networking skills and business skills that will allow them to function successfully.
I think it's a great point. I mean, those are really interesting sectors, because I agree with everything you said about their attributes and what can happen in terms of how social capital and other things can really influence access. But the flip side of them is one of the reasons why I think they're at the cutting edge of this happening is they're among the easiest sectors to demonstrate whether you can really do it or not. And if you can, it's not clear as much that industry particularly cares if you have formal certification. I mean, you know, the obvious examples of Bill Gates and, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and others who were, you know, they didn't bother with a degree because they had such a great idea, but you're seeing it even more with programmers, right? I mean, you know, when you look at how Google hires, right, they test. They basically say, you know, show us what you can do, and if you can code, they care much less about, you know, they'd like to know you were really bright, you had the right pedigree, but, you know, much less about that. But I think it is it's a big issue in terms of how we think about creating that access. And, you know, one of the other things that I think is interesting there is what we see in terms of some of the early inequalities in terms of gender. So women now are making up, you know, a majority of students in higher ed, but we see much less, particularly, at least in the US, in early STEM, early computer science. And so thinking about what you can do to introduce folks early so that they've got that, not that everyone will go, but at least that, you know, that's open. I think it's really.
Okay, any more questions? Right, got one over there.
Sorry, Chris Wallace, Warwick. Fascinating thing, lots of little things bubbling up.
Yeah.
Can I just draw attention to two things that we're not talking about?
Sure.
One is, we're not talking about because we're ignoring it, and the other is the elephant in the room.
Right.
The first one is, with the expansion of universities, the expansion of students,
Yeah.
the student numbers, that's been our focus. But actually one thing we're not talking about is the labour market for academics,
Right.
and the connection between the two. So for example, it strikes me, and maybe economics may be a feature of this as well, with the drawing into the UK of lots of international students,
Right.
Chinese students, for example, in mathematics, we're not producing homegrown mathematics lecturers anymore.
Right.
There's a shortage of lecturers if they disappear at home. That matters if some of the universities are anchor institutions. In other words, they're crumbling underneath. So that's one thing I think we need to shift on. And the other is the elephant in the room, which is that focusing on quantity, we're not focusing on quality.
Right.
What is actually being taught, and some of the issues of pedagogy and curriculum. We do touch on it when we talk about things like the REE, but that's the kind of skewed version of quality.
Right.
And I'm thinking, well, looking back on what David Willis has been saying about universities needing to align their courses more with what
Right.
employers want.
Right.
But when you ask what employers want, outside things like law and medicine, where it's very tight coupling, they're interested in things like soft skills.
Right.
So can universities teach soft skills? And you know, spent 25 years in the university, and the last people you want to teach soft skills are academics. So can we really do that?
Right.
Can we align with employer expectations?
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
if we come back
sure.
on that, is that a
I was going to
similar
ask,
area?
Please.
well, exactly the quality point. There's
Yeah.
always a tension between sort of flexibility, standardisation, what is happening, because there's a degree of nervousness, as has been indicated, about the quality side. And I think linked to that is the experience I had in India, where there's a massive issue about levels of education generally in the population. So there seems to be a massive sort of undercurrent of lack of education opportunity right from the age of virtually nothing, where the villages don't send the kids to school and such. So something there about the massive social inequality issues which is coming from that.
Yep.
Okay. And coming back on that as well, I think in this sort of space of influencing what's taught, one of the other drivers within the UK at the moment is trying to strengthen collective leadership. And you know, you've mentioned in your notes increasing the sort of ties between industry and providers in coming up with these kind of collective solutions. I think that raises issues as well about the interplay between what's provided in a workplace, increasingly what's provided in a kind of higher education classroom setting, those kind of dimensions. So I just wondered if, in reflecting on your answer, if there are any kind of similar dimensions there, because that gets over the point you were saying about, well, employees don't care, perhaps, individual employees don't care, but collectively, it might be more of a high responsibility.
Sure. So, diverse range of points. So, come back if I miss some, but no, Chris, on yours, I agree. I mean, I think there is, obviously, there's got to be a real concern with quality. What was interesting to me in looking, you know, having looked at this fairly intensely for a number of years and then having been doing some other stuff and coming back, when I looked at the data, and I think we've got some slides there I can point to if you want, but what I would have expected to see with the very sharp rise in costs in the UK for higher ed, and the huge increase in numbers that happened in the system, I would have expected to have seen a much bigger increase in attrition rates. I mean, if you look at what happened in the continent where they expanded in Germany, France, others, you let lot more people in, you didn't put in commensurate resources, and as a result, you had lots of people not getting through and not getting access to classes. And also, I would have expected an increase in inequality similar to what we were seeing in the US, when actually neither of those has occurred. So I think I'm sure there are the micro issues in terms of the quality of the classroom experience, and that are going to need attention, particularly as people become more aware of what they're investing and what's happening in the graduate labor market. But at least at that broadest level, I think it's actually been really interesting to see what has happened. I think the RAE combined with the issue about graduate programs, it is a real issue as you look about the future there. I do think that it's relatively solvable without a huge amount of intervention, because my understanding is the same thing that's avoided the inequality by being able to provide good scholarships and bursaries for lower income students to go to undergrad. You can do that by making generous support for domestic students to pursue PhDs, if you want, right? If anything, in the US now, outside of a few fields, we've gone the other way, where we've got pretty generous funding that way, but because we did away with mandatory retirement, academia's, it's got challenges, but it's a pretty good gig, and lots of professors are not retiring, and so you made it really hard for people to get, I mean, we haven't been creating the job slots. We keep predicting the shortage will come, but they haven't been coming. So I think there's really interesting questions there. The issue you point to about inequality, particularly in India, is massive. I mean, that's what really interested me in that is, and you see huge disparities. So you go to some states and they're at 90% levels of literacy, and almost everybody gets a good basic education, and in others it's under half that are even finishing lower secondary education. And so you have to address it. The government has passed a law for the first time since India became independent, saying education through to secondary education is a basic right that everyone has access to, but so far it hasn't had a lot of teeth, so it hasn't been able to be enforced in the same way. There's actually a British academic whose work really influenced me a lot, who's a very innovative guy named James Tooley, who's been over there and pioneered. And what he's focused on, he wrote a book called The Beautiful Tree, and what he's focused on is how before the Raj, and if you look in countries all around the world, rural Africa, whatnot, what you see is that actually villages do invest in education if left to themselves, even if it's very poorly resourced, but that if you have the right supports for that, that it provides a potential mechanism to address more effectively than the big problem right now is the government said on paper that this exists, but like on an average day, 25% of the teachers don't turn up at the school. So it's pretty hard to get decent results when you don't even know if you're going to have somebody there. So I think that is a huge issue there. But more broadly, I think it's an issue in all of these societies, because what we're seeing is that almost regardless of the sector, people are realizing that without a decent, at least basic education through secondary, if not higher ed, it's almost impossible for you to participate in a significant way in the global economy. And so you can do lower level work, in agriculture and in services domestically, but you're not going to get what most people are aspiring to in terms of the aspirations to gain from this. And that's, I think, that's why you see hunger for it among millions in India. At the same time, you're seeing some of the issues you described. And in terms of the employer buy-in, I do think, to me, one of the most alarming trends I see when I look at what otherwise I think is a pretty good picture in UK higher ed is the sharp drop that you're seeing in the part-time courses and the sandwich courses for that intermediate skills. And I know we have some sessions we'll talk about tomorrow on some of this, but that's the area where I think that there's interesting potential and focus. And one of the things I'm a big fan of in the US, which has its analogies here in Scotland and the UK, is there what we call it cooperative education. But if you look at universities like Northeastern or Drexel University, they have really built their whole brand, their success around the notion that students may take another semester or even a year to graduate, but they're doing very real work paid, integrated fully into their course. And the employers love it because they're seeing people who are coming out totally prepared. You know, the hiring rate from those is in the very high 90s for their graduates coming out of these courses, because they feel like they've had the right mix of getting the foundations that they need, but then really getting a chance to apply it, and they go back and forth in that. And so they're really coming out, I think, very well prepared for the jobs that folks are looking for.
Dave, can you repeat the name of those two
Sure.
institutions?
Northeastern, which is based in Boston, but actually has been interesting. It's one of the very few U.S. universities that has set up branch campuses in the U.S. So they've set up one in the Seattle area. They've set up one in Charlotte, North Carolina. They basically picked areas where there were lots of employers and where they didn't feel they were being well served by the local universities, and they were basically pulled in. So like North Carolina is where a lot of German investment has come around the auto industry and other things, so they've gone there. The other is Drexel University, which is based out of Philadelphia. And those are two which have put, they're really known. And there are exceptions, I would say. Most US universities are not particularly strong in this, but they've really resourced and put it in. They have whole departments where all they do is these placements, you know, is those relationships with employers, because that's what they see as really central to why did you pick Northeastern over the, 50 other good universities in the Boston area, and that's what.
Well, I'm really sorry to say this, but it is 1 o'clock, so I'm a party pooper here, and I'm sure you agree with me that has just been a really fabulous session, so thank you very much, David. I can tell people still have questions, but maybe you can kind of catch up with you another time.
Sure.
We've included on your seats leaflets in terms of highlighting future masterclasses. And as before, if there's any kind of particular feedback you want to give us about future topics or how to run them, then we'll happily receive those. But if we can take this opportunity to thank David